Hello, everyone. In the novel I'm going to share with you today, the female protagonist Emrie's experience is just like a fantastic adventure. She wakes up on a ship, with a mysterious wolf general by her side, and she's seriously injured. The most shocking thing is that she seems to have some special power, and this injury might be connected to the awakening of her power. However, the general says nothing about her power and even seems a bit impatient when she asks questions. What secrets are hidden here? Let's uncover the mystery of this story together. Chapter 10. A sliver of golden sunlight crept through the narrow window, caressing Lady Emrie's closed eyelids and gently tickling her long lashes. She stirred, a sudden, sharp pain lancing through the back of her skull. Tears welled up and widened, her vulnerable state amplified by the intense discomfort. Why did everything hurt so terribly? A soft, feminine voice whispered. The unknown caretaker pressed a cool, damp cloth against Lady Emrie's throbbing forehead. Despite the gentle ministrations, it provided little respite from the relentless pain. Unable to open her eyes, Lady Emrie felt hot tears spill down her cheeks. The agony was overwhelming, and she cowed and suppressed a heart-wrenching sob. "It's okay. Relax, Lady Emrie," the caretaker soothed, her tone laced with genuine concern. But Lady Emrie didn't want to relax. Every fiber of her being longed to curl into a tight ball, to clutch her head desperately until the excruciating pain subsided. Yet her body felt impossibly heavy, refusing to obey her commands. Her sobs intensified, raw emotion pouring out of her. "No, it's all right. It's all right. It's all right. It's all right." The caretaker's voice took on a note of urgency, losing some of its earlier gentleness as she shifted her weight on the bed beside Lady Emrie. Another wave of pain crashed through Lady Emrie's skull, eliciting a whimper. "Make it. Stop," she pleaded between sobs, feeling as though 1,000 hammers were pounding relentlessly inside her head. She sensed the gold power simmering within her chest, waiting for the pain to claim her and set it free. More tears streamed down her face, a physical manifestation of her anguish. "Drink this. It will help," the caretaker urged softly. Lady Emrie felt pressure against her lower lip as a cool liquid touched her tongue. She parted her lips, allowing the soothing concoction to flow into her mouth. A wave of blessed relief washed over her as the familiar, comforting embrace of sleep began to envelop her senses. Her ragged breathing eased as she relaxed back into the soft bedding, her tears slowly drying on her cheeks. She drew in a deep, calming breath. "Go back to sleep. You will feel better when you wake again," the caretaker whispered. Lady Emrie didn't need to be told twice, gratefully surrendering to the peaceful oblivion of slumber. When Lady Emrie's eyes fluttered open once more, warm twilight suffused the tiny room. The sun's dying rays filtered through the small window across from her bed, painting the cramped space in muted hues. She frowned, realizing this unfamiliar setting was not her room at the inn. A pained groan escaped her lips as she slowly pushed herself into a sitting position, her gaze sweeping across the confined, shadowy chamber. Confusion etched itself across her features as she blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings. Where was I? The hard cot I was lying on suddenly swayed, along with the room, and I gripped tightly at my forehead as the notion made me ridiculously dizzy. Male voices shouted in the distance. A bird called, and I suddenly realized the one small window in the room was a porthole. I was on a boat. What in the world happened? I tried to stand on my feet, but the ship's weight again and the dizziness made me fall right back down. I let out another groan. I had never been seasick before. This was something else, but I was starting to get beyond freaked out, and that was going to stop me from finding out what the hell was going on. The next time I rose to my feet, I was able to clamp onto the small desk beside me before the ship's weight again and the dizziness hit. My stomach bubbled unpleasantly, but I forced my heavy body to stay on my feet. I was wearing a dark green, long tunic that was way too big for me, and a pair of black cotton pants that clung tightly to my legs. I didn't bother wondering how I got changed. That would just add on to the headache already hammering at the back of my skull. I waited for the room to still again before forcing my sluggish body to the small wooden door. I leaned heavily against the wall before easing the barrier open with a harsh sigh. That was a lot heavier than it should have been. A small hallway met my aching eyes, and I blinked in confusion at the light from the setting sun that streamed into view. No visitor quarters were ever on the first deck, not in any passenger-carrying ship. I forced myself to stay upright as I stepped out of the room and into the hallway, my hands pressed firmly into the walls on either side of me. It was the only thing keeping me from falling. I stopped at the entrance of the open hall, just small steps separating me from the deck. I frowned up into the dimming light of the day. What an odd boat. Climbing those two steps was harder than I expected, and I let out another pained groan when that throbbing at the back of my skull started again. But I pushed past it. Or 𝐊𝐿𝐳 or Terif, the big wolf, Thorn was sitting on a large crate at the side of the rather small deck, his torso bare as he wound a thick wrap of gauze around his stomach. I gaped over at him. I had seen him completely nude before, so the stark contrast of tight skin over firm muscles washed what shocked me. No, the large, open gashes running down his back and along his side did. Oh my God. I whispered in horror as I forced my heavy feet forward, my headache still raging, but long forgotten. The general's head snapped up the minute my voice reached his sensitive ears, and he glanced over his shoulder with startled eyes. Lady Emrie. His voice was gruff as he shifted on the box, his large body stiff as he turned to face me. I wanted to cringe at the pain that must have caused him. You should be resting, he practically growled, but continued to roll the gauze around his stomach, hiding the even deeper wound there. I ignored him as the ship swayed again and I fell onto a smaller crate beside him. His golden eyes flickered down to me. Let me help. I stammered rather dazed as another wave of dizzy washed over my mind. His gaze turned hard. You need to go lay back down, my lady. His voice was necessarily angry, but I could hear the hard demand in his tone. I ignored it and reached over to take the gauze from him. His hand tightened on the wrapping before he let out an aggravated sigh and gave it to me. What happened? My voice was a hoarse murmur from lack of use, but I knew despite the shouts from the ship's crew and crashing waves, that he could hear me. There were more of those sewer rats than I had expected. He growled and flinched a little when I wrapped the bandage a little too tight. I gave him an apologetic smile. Sewer rats? I asked softly as he lifted his arm for me to finish wrapping around him. He grunted and glanced down at my hands. Serpent, shifters, bottom dwellers, whatever you want to call them. They can never fully shift human and smell awful. I wrinkled my nose in distaste at his words, but tried not to say anything as I grabbed the tape beside him and secured the end of the bandage. This was the most civilized conversation we had ever had, and I didn't want to risk ruining it. I knew what he was talking about, or at least, I thought I did. It seemed familiar, but every time I tried to remember, the back of my head throbbed painfully. How did we get here? I asked softly as I sat down on the wooden box beside him and tried not sway dizzily. My head still ached. The light, although dim, was hurting my eyes, and I wanted nothing more than to fall back asleep. I brought us. He grumbled and winced as he tried to reach over for his tunic. Let me help, I started again, despite the nauseous feeling swamping in my stomach. He lifted his lip in a snarl. Don't even think about it. You can barely stand, he growled as he used his good arm to pull the tunic over his head. I didn't miss how his face twisted in pain at that action. It made me frown. Du wolf, born's not heal as fast the rumors say. I wondered quietly as he finally pulled the shirt completely over his hard chest and let out a pained sigh. I wasn't sure how long we had been on the small boat, but I was under the impression his species healed within minutes. Yet, even the king needed help to heal. We do, he grumbled as he leaned forward with a wince and rested his arms heavily against his large thighs. The bottom feeders have venom in their talons. It slows down the healing process. I closed my eyes and tried to push the urge to vomit down as the ship rocked again. The cot barely a few meters away looked really good right then. "Where's May?" "And 𝐿𝐿𝐼𝐬. I mumbled sleepily as I let my body sway softly with the ship. If I kept my eyes closed and pretended I was laying down. But dizziness didn't bother me so much. "They're still at the lower kingdom." His dark grumble made me frown, and I forced my eyes to feel open. He was still leaning heavily against his knees, his breath leaving in hard drags as he stared out at the water surrounding us. Were we not? Where are we going? His bright golden eyes flickered to mine before he licked his lips and glanced away again. He stayed silent for a moment, his jaw ticking as my body began to slowly feel heavier and heavier. "Terif, we are going back to the north." My breath lodged in my throat, and my heart paused in my chest. What? I wasn't sure how to feel about that knowledge. I had never wanted to leave in the first place, and I always wanted to experience a true winter there. But if May and Lay were still in the northern kingdom, I shouldn't be leaving them. I couldn't go back to the stuffy village, with the overbearing elders, and their incessant exams. They would poke and prod at me until they could figure out the gold, power, until they could hold it in their grasp. I doubted my body would be able to handle much more of it. And 𝐿𝐼𝐬 was there to moderate it like last time. I have informed the king about what has happened. I was surprised at the soft tone in his voice, at the uncertain look dancing around his golden gaze. For once, his eyes would not glance up at mine, and his tone was not crude. He is very upset. The king was upset over something I couldn't even remember. And yet, my chest ached at the notion. What exactly happened? The nauseous feeling in my stomach was easing, but the heavy sleep behind my eyes only grew worse. It took all my willpower not to lean heavily against the wounded wolf and fall asleep. The general let out a heavy sigh and glanced over at me as I blinked sleepily up at him. His golden eyes flashed and he frowned. "You are exhausted, Lady Emrie, and your body still needs time to heal." "Heal from what?" He was the one with the severed gashes running along his upper body. I opened my mouth to protest, but he was shaking his head and rising to his feet with a wince before I could. "I will explain more after you rest." I let him help me to my feet, even though the action obviously was painful for him, but he didn't complain. I had to grip heavily onto his large arm to keep from falling, no matter how hard I tried to walk on my own. He let out an irritated sigh halfway across the deck and ended up wrapping his good arm around my waist and lifting me easily into the air. "I'm sorry, but you are taking forever," he growled as he carried me across the small ship and down the 2 short steps to the hallway that held the room I woke up in. He never once complained of any pain as he helped me ease back onto the cot and lifted the coarse blanket over my shaky body. "Where's your room?" My voice was a hoarse murmur as my heavy eyes watched him pull out the desk chair that was far too small for him and sit down. He snorted. "Don't have one. I've been sleeping here." I wanted to widen my eyes and stutter in disbelief, but my body was too heavy and the pain in the back of my head was quickly growing. "That can't be comfortable," I was able to mumble before my eyes closed. His deep chuckle reached through my subconscious. "Anything to keep you alive, my Lady Amp." I was still confused the next time I woke, but at least I knew the rocking of my cot and room was from the waves. There was still a dull ache at the back of my head, but the nausea was gone and it was easier to stand on my feet. I let out a soft groan as I pulled my heavy body off the bed. It was dark outside, from what I could tell through the little round window, and I had no idea how long I had been sleeping. But I knew it must have been a while. The deck of the small ship was rather empty when I dragged my heavy body out of my room. Only a few crew members floated around. It was hard to spot the large wolf, borne leaning cosily against the edge of the ship. His eyes closed as his face pointed towards the sky. I walked slowly over to him. "How long have I been sleeping?" That was as much of a greeting as I could spare him. He seemed so lost in his thoughts, so determined to count every single star in that sky, but I didn't want to interrupt him without an absolute reason. His golden eyes flickered down to me as I stopped at his side, my hands gripping tightly onto the cool wooden rail of the ship. "A while." His voice was almost soft as his dark eyes glanced back out into the darkness of the crashing waves. My lips pulled into a frown. Well, that didn't answer my question at all. How long have we been at sea? A while. I let out a quiet sigh. Well, okay then. Do you wonder if the king is still upset? I asked softly as our bodies swayed gently with the ship against the deep water. He shifted uncomfortably beside me and let out a soft wince. I know he is. My chest clenched at the gruff grumble that passed the large general's lips, and I darted my tongue out to lick my own. What exactly happened? Terif. My voice was practically a soft whisper against the steady wind of the sea, but I knew he could still hear. He let out a soft sigh and closed his golden eyes before turning around with a shake of his head. I watched patiently as he leaned back against the railing and ran a heavy hand down his face. A knee filled my stomach. I had never seen the wolf so anxious before. We ran into some serpent shifters on the way back from the inn, and they wanted more than just your money. He started slowly, unsurely, like he didn't know if he was supposed to tell me or not. I frowned and leaned back against the railing beside him. Images of large, dark masses circling us flitted through my mind, but every time I tried to pin the memory down, my head would throb painfully and they would disappear. I'm not sure why, but they wanted you and your little underling friend. My heart dropped to my stomach at that statement, and I rubbed my fist against my chest. Did they know about me? My voice was a weak murmur as it passed my lips. If that was the case, no wonder the king would be upset. He made it adamantly clear about how he didn't want the world to know about me. But if they somehow did, he definitely wouldn't be happy. I'm not sure. Terif's tone came out as a dark grumbled as he dropped his gaze to the deck. His thick arms crossed firmly over his chest. But I don't think so. They are usually slave traders and smugglers, or could be working for one. His words Schulten sent a wave of relief through me. But they did. If he didn't think they knew I was supposed to be the king of the North's mate, then they probably didn't. A sharp stab of pain zapped straight through my skull and I groaned before reaching tenderly for my head. Terif's gaze flickered down to me. Why is my head throbbing like this? I moaned in discomfort as he shifted uneasily again. The general clenched his jaw before glancing away, his posture stiffening. One of the sewer rates. They slammed your head into a nearby building before I could reach you. My eyes widened in surprise at the remorse that was suddenly clouding his voice, and I gazed up at him as he turned away from me, his large shoulders tense. General, I failed my orders, allowed you to be hurt. I failed my king. The surprise quickly left my chest and I tried not to roll my eyes, like he would ever actually feel any sort of sympathy over me being hurt. All that remorse was because he felt the king. I let out a soft sigh before turning back around to look at the dark water. I'm sure there was nothing you could have done. I still could barely remember the attack. Just a few dark shapes and that ridiculous thing. But I knew, despite his lack of any type of emotion, that he would try everything in his power to not allow anything happen to me. He wouldn't betray his king like that. He only made a 𝐏𝐤𝐳 sound in the back of his throat. So, we are going back the mountain, I murmured softly as he turned around and leaned against the rail once again, his stiff shoulders easing. He didn't say anything. I love the North. Don't get me wrong, but the last thing I want to deal with are those elders and their constant exams. I grumbled into the quiet air as he leaned heavily beside me. The gold power had been silent since that time in the mountain with the king. But I had a sickening feeling that the more tests the elders and their medicine men ran, the more it was going to tick it off. I don't think you will have to worry about that. What do you mean? I asked with a frown as he clasped his hands in front of him and blinked up at the night sky. I doubt the king will want you far from him for a while. He wishes to keep an eye on you. My heart stopped at his words, my breath catching slightly in my throat. The king wants me, close to him. After all those nights, weeks of silently begging up to the heavens to let me be close to him, I was actually going to be. He wouldn't leave the castle, though. Oh no. That's his kingdom. He would never stray too far under the mountain for very long, but that would mean I would have to go to him. I believe he does not intend on letting you leave the castle. Chapter 11 𝐿𝐴𝐿. I asked softly as the general and I stood side by side on our respective crates, 2 bowls of some odd, soup-like thing in our hands. I frowned down at the curling brown liquid that swashed sluggishly against the wooden bowl. That was definitely not normal. She was a little shaken up when I brought her back to the tavern, but she should be fine. He grunted before spooning the tasteless brown liquid past his lips. Well, at least he didn't have a problem eating it. It turned out that the small ship Terif found us passage on was not a passenger ship, but a small merchant vessel built light and small for speed. It sailed frequently between the kingdoms, dropping off and loading supplies. I honestly was surprised that the wolf was able to get us on board. Everyone was too afraid of him to say no. It's been 2 days since the general told me I would be staying at the castle for the foreseeable future, and my memories from the attack were slowly coming back, despite the constant pain in my head. I thought they had. I stumbled over my words miserably as I gave up on the stoop and placed it beside me. My eyes locked on the boots covering my small feet. The dark chuckle that left the wolf-born's lips surprised me, and I snapped my gaze to his as he shook his head, his dark hair brushing softly across his forehead. It's going to take a lot more than a few sewer rats to kill me, my lady. I smiled at the amusement in his tone before resting my head back against my shoulders to enjoy the afternoon sun on my face. And you saved us. So thank you again. Those are my orders. I would have saved you regardless. I sighed and rolled my eyes behind closed eyelids. Why didn't he just accept thank you? We were quiet for a few minutes, but the silence was tense like I would have assumed. He seemed to be warming up to me over the past couple of days, for lack of a better term. Of course, he would still throw in a crude comment or sneer here or there, but in all honesty, he was a lot nicer. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. We will be arriving at the mountain in a few days. He started a few minutes later after he finished whatever was in that soup before placing the wooden bowl down at his feet. The king has informed me that you underlings. I didn't miss how he rolled the word distaste fully over his tongue before snapping those golden eyes up to me. Have a very different culture than ours. I frowned at the way his dark eyes flashed and his face fell into a noticeable scowl, but I didn't bother interrupting. One day I would figure out what his problem was. He wanted you to keep that in mind before we arrive. There are things you do and don't do in our kingdom. My frown only grew at his words, and I could tell he saw the question in my eyes, but he held his hand up before I could even speak. That's his place to explain. I sulked down on my crate. The general was the absolute worst person to get any type of information from ever. You know, you're horrible at holding conversations. I grumbled as he let out a small groan and began to stand. I know. Enjoy the sun while it lasts. We will be hitting northern waters soon. He gave me a small bow, his golden eyes flashing before he turned and walked away to the small room that held our belongings. I let out a sigh as I turned my face back up to the sky. The sun did not reach the mountain much, and the water at its base was always freezing. I haven't spent a true winter there in years, but I wouldn't be surprised if the sea at its bottom was completely ice. I could already see dark storm clouds taking over the blue skyway out in the distance. I loved the winter, but blizzards at sea did not sound like fun. The sun was slowly beginning to set, and the air grew chillier as I hugged the green to knit tighter around me. It was getting colder, and there was nothing much to do on the deck besides enjoy the view. I guess I could go read that book some more. I groaned and rubbed the back of my head softly as I stood to my feet. The pain wasn't as bad as before, but it was still there, and it throbbed every time something brushed against the back of my head. That serpent shifter must have slammed me against the wall really hard. I took my time as I walked across the slow deck and down the 2 steps. It calmed the pain in my head and didn't make my body feel so drained. Not eating probably was going to help anything either. She has almost completely healed. I paused just outside of our small room and furrowed my eyebrows as Terif's voice spoke softly through the closed wooden door. I know it was impolite to eavesdrop, but I cowled and helped myself. I tried to stay as quiet as possible as I pressed my ear against the thin lid. Was he talking to himself? About me? How will not be satisfied until I see her. The minute that voice hit my ears, that deep, soul-shaking voice, my heart thumped painful in my chest. That was Eric, that was the king's voice. My headache was back, for a whole new reason. Maybe I was just going insane. Maybe that hit bruised my skull and I was definitely imagining things that weren't there. I know. We are only a few days away. Do you still wish for me to take her up the mountain as soon as we arrive? Yes. Liberius has been lurking around, and I do not think my absence will go unnoticed if I disappear to meet you. My heart was beating uncontrollably in my chest, and I was honestly surprised 𝐿𝐴𝐷𝐸 hear it. I definitely heard the king's voice that time. There was no way I was imagining it. Unless I was dreaming and this was all in my head. I almost squeaked at the unexpected dark growl that sounded through the closed door, but slapped my hand over my mouth just in time. I do not understand why you insist on keeping him alive. Terif's hard voice practically snarled as I stood with wide eyes just outside the door. Do not question me, General. Eric growled, the deep sound resonating low in my chest and sent the pit of butterflies in my stomach haywire. I let out a shaky breath. Okay, that was it. There was no way this was a dream. He is a traitor. Terif barely finished his sentence before I twisted the knob and pushed the door wide open. It was impolite, and a complete disregard to any manners I had. But it was impossible for the king to be there. Two pairs of eyes turned to me. One was that dark gold I had grown so familiar to, and the other was that bright lightning blue that haunted my dreams. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't even speak as my gaze locked with the king's. His shimmery form pulled into a small frown. He was there. Not really. I mean, I could clearly see his perfectly sculpted face and large body, but he stood in the middle of the room as a pale blue, shimmering light, as if he were a ghost. I reached a shaky hand up and pressed it against my suddenly throbbing forehead. Emrie, the shimmery king said on a soft, almost stressed sigh, his blue eyes flashing brightly as they scanned my flushed face. Terif stood stock still next to him, his face pale, but emotional as his gaze locked on me. I gulped loudly in the tense silence that filled the room, and staggered against the wall. What's going on? I muttered as my suddenly ridiculously heavy body slowly started to fall to the floor. The king's eyes flashed and his jaw clenched, but Terif was the one who was suddenly at my side, gripping tightly onto my arm and leading me over to the bed. Not that the shimmering, see-through king would have been of much use. I told you not to overdo yourself. The general's voice was a stern growl as he eased me slowly onto the cot. My lady, he added as an afterthought when his dark eyes flickered up to the blue apparition standing in the middle of the room. I gave Terif a sheepish smile. I didn't. It just started hurting. I murmured as my eyes started to flutter heavily against my cheeks. I blinked, and the king disappeared. I frowned and tried to ignore the sudden hollow, painful feeling in my chest when the general walked away from me and picked up an odd black stone off the ground. What just happened? Terif. I mumbled softly as I lay down on my side and blinked sleepily up at him. My body was just too heavy to stay upright anymore. He paused, his shoulders going stiff before he slipped the black stone into his bag. You are tired. You should rest, he muttered before bending down to the large wooden bowl filled with water in the corner of the room, and walking back over to me with the cool cloth in his hands. I frowned up at him and wanted to object, but one scalding look from those gold eyes had my lips sealing shut. I sighed in relief as he placed the cool cloth on my forehead as it helped ease my headache somewhat. I closed my eyes and cuddled into the scratchy blanket of the cot as he sat down heavily in the chair beside me. He let out a ragged breath. You, my lady, just fucking love getting me in trouble. He grumbled into the tense quiet of the room. I was too tired to answer him. That night dreamed of the king, of his strong fingers gently stroking my hair and playing with the ends as he had done so many weeks before. Visions of that blue gaze filled my mind's eyes as that beautiful voice spoke in a lullaby to my ears. I woke the next morning with my first genuine smile in days. I was finally going to spend actual time with the king. With Eric. We crossed the northern border. Terif's gruff voice announced as he walked into the cramped room with heavy cloak draped over his wide shoulders. He didn't bother knocking. The temperature is below freezing, and quickly dropping. Wear this, he commanded as he tossed a second smaller cloak on my feet. I frowned. Good morning to you two. I mumbled up at him before slowly easing out beneath the blanket. The tunic and skin, hugging, pants I wore did little to stop the instant freezing air that washed over me, and I quickly pulled the heavy fur cloak over my shoulders. Terif only grunted. We will be at the mountain in little more than a day. There will be no time to stop at your little village on the way, so I hope what you brought to the lower kingdom with you will suffice. My frown grew and I bit my bottom lip as I looked over at the trunk by the base of the cot. He had managed to grab all our belongings, and me before we left the lower kingdom, which I was internally grateful over. But all my clothes were light fabrics. I packed for the warmer weather of the south, not the freezing cold of our home. I did not pack clothing appropriate for the winter. I admitted softly as his large form headed for the thin wooden door. He paused and let out an irritated sigh. Fine. I will inform the king when we arrive. Just wear the cloak until then. I frowned at the brisk, brooding tone of his voice and watched as he hurried quickly from the room, as if he did not want to be around me any longer than he had to. I ran a shaky hand through my long and rather tangled hair. I guess that pleasantness he briefly showed was long gone. That, or he was terrified of me bombarding him with questions over that black stone and the king appearing out of thin air. I wouldn't bother asking him, though. He never seemed to answer anyways. I would just wait until the king and I were alone. Alone. The king and I. For the first time in weeks. Alone. The thought made me feel like a giddy little girl. I let out a tired sigh and followed slowly after the grumpy wolf, born. My head felt 10 times better than the day before, and despite the dull tenderness at the back of my skull, it wasn't bothering me much. I walked slowly from the room and climbed the few steps onto the ship's main deck, my eyes wide at the sight of the white, icy fog that crowded the air, and the lanterns hanging along the rails offered the only visible light for us to see. Whoa, I murmured quietly as I tried to scan the small ship for the large general. Even in this cloudy fog, his large form should be visible. And yet, I still could not see him. Terif, I am here. I let out a loud gasp and jumped at the gruff voice that suddenly spoke right in my ear. He chuckled as I gripped hastily at my chest and drew in deep, ragged breaths. Sneaking up on someone is not nice. I snapped as his golden eyes glowed down at me through the thick fog. They flashed as he chuckled again. I find it amusing. Apparently. I grumbled and turned away from him to stalk towards the dimly lit railing with a huff. He followed closely behind. Be careful. My lady. Watch your step. His tone still held that arrogant amusement, but I just ignored him as I stopped at the edge of the ship and gripped tightly onto the rail. Do you see that? He asked as he stood at my side, his tone easing as his large hand pointed towards an odd patch of water visible below us. Barely? What is it? I asked softly as I leaned a little way over the railing to get a better look. He snarled and gripped tightly onto the back of my cloak before pulling me away from the side. I rolled my eyes. It's ice. The closer we get to the mountain, the more of it you'll see. I frowned and leaned further away from the rail as he crossed his large arms over his chest. Does the ocean freeze at the base? My breath came out as fog of its own as I breathed in the icy air of the north. I loved the winter. Not completely. There should be some opening for the ship to sail into port. And the king is not meeting us. It was a question, but I still gave him pause for answer. The large wolf, born, still beside me, and his glowing golden eyes flickered down to mine before back out at the white fog. No, he has business to attend to at the castle. I see. I trailed off slowly as he leaned uneasily away from me. General, do not ask me anything. He growled before I could even finish my sentence. I frowned and bit my bottom lip. Well, okay then. I will not tell you anything the king does not wish for you to know. Why'd Osen he want me to know? I grumbled at his large back as he turned away with an irritated sigh. Because he doesn't. I stood there silently and watched him stalk away with a glare. He was beyond infuriating. Why can't he just tell me something? Anything. Just one little sliver of information to stop making those insane notions running through my head. I let him go without a hassle. He wouldn't cave no matter what I said. The day passed by slowly, and I only knew when the sun had started to set when the white fog slowly turned dark. Snow had begun to fall from the sky and blanketed the top of the ship in a thin white sheen. I stood huddling into the thick cloak Terif had given me on my little crate, watching the white flakes fall from the dark clouds. Thunder rolled in the distance. My lady. I glanced over to the mast in the middle of the ship where the large general was standing with a scowl on his stern face. I frowned. The snow will start falling heavily in the next hour. You need to be below deck. The king will kill me if you get sick. I rolled my eyes and let out a sigh before standing from the cool wooden crate. I'm fine. Terif. I love the snow, and it's never bothered me before. I grumbled, but found myself heading below deck anyway. He followed slowly behind. Like always. You have not experienced a true winter on the mountain yet. You haven't seen snow. He practically growled as he followed me down the 2 short steps and into the cramped room, like he was dead, set on making sure I wasn't going to run up to the deck again anytime soon. And how would you know that? I grumbled as I grabbed the history myth book from out of my trunk before plopping down heavily on the hard cot. He grunted before taking a seat on the wooden chair. According to him, we had only been on the ship for about 2 weeks, and I slept through the first one. I felt bad. He had been sleeping in that uncomfortable chair the entire time. But whenever I offered to switch places, he would just snarl and shoot me a glare. I took that as a no. There was silence between us as I sat on the bed reading the little wolf book clutched between my fingers. I paused and thumbed the edge of one of the old yellow pages before glancing up at the silent brooding general. What is it like? Living with him? I asked softly as his golden eyes stared out the small window across the room. His gaze slowly flitted over to mine. It is. He paused and crossed his arms over his hard chest before bringing his gaze back to the window. Difficult. I frowned at his answer, but he didn't seem like he was going to elaborate anytime soon. How so? I urged softly as I closed the book and pressed it to my chest. It was almost comfortably. He clenched and unclenched his jaw, his eyes slowly rolling around the expanse of our tiny space. He is loyal to his people, to his generals, but that does not mean he is lenient. He does not appreciate those who disagree with him, and shows little mercy to whoever crosses him. I felt my lips pull into a small frown. The king always seemed so gentle with me, and I long since stopped believing in the rumors that revolved around him. But he was a strong ruler. He protected his kingdom, and the mountain. 𝐿𝐲𝐻 fought in what seemed like 100 wars, and showed little mercy for stragglers he crossed his border. Perhaps he wasn't as soft as made him out to be. Do not worry, my lady. I highly doubt he will be anything but kind to you. Terif's voice was gruff and coarse, but I found it oddly reassuring. I let that simple statement calm my racing nerves, even though it did little to stop the worry building in my chest. We were never supposed to be together. I was never supposed to have him. He even said he didn't really know what to do with me. I did not expect to be treated any differently than the others under his care. But no matter what, I knew he wouldn't hurt me. He couldn't, even if he tried. You are being awfully quiet. The general grumbled what felt like hours later as I staring at 𝐋𝐮𝐧𝐷 and leaned at the wall. I turned my gaze towards his stoic face, but his golden eyes were still locked at the small circular window. My lips pulled into a small smile. I figured you would be happy about that. He only snorted and glanced away, but my mind was still reeling. I wanted to ask him more about Eric, about how the king felt about me. Did he confide in the general about his problems? Did he say that he had never wanted a mate, and didn't know what to do with me? Did he say he didn't want me? I chewed anxiously on my bottom lip. He told me how he never wanted a mate. I admitted softly as my voice passed my lips rather breathlessly. The cold had crept slowly into our little room, and I had wrapped the cloak and blanket from the cot tightly around me in search of warmth. His dark gaze slid slowly towards mine, and narrowed. Did he know? He seemed to murmur thoughtfully before he let his eyes roam back to the window. My frown only grew. I don't think you will have to worry about that, Lady Emrie. You think he did always want one? I couldn't keep the desperate plea from my voice, the one practically begging Terif to tell me that the king did in fact want me. If he noticed my tone. He didn't show it. He let out a small sigh before adjusting in his uncomfortable seat. All I know was that he looked for a very long time when he was younger, before he finally gave up hope, and he grew to slowly forget, to only feel care and loyalty for his people. He paused and let out another small sigh before stretching his long legs out in front of him. And now you finally came along, and he doesn't know what to do anymore. He looked for a very long time. That one simple sentence brought hope to my aching chest, even if he didn't want one now. At one point in his life, he had wanted me, or the idea of what I was supposed to be to him. Maybe he would grow to want a mate again. Maybe, just maybe he would grow to want me. When he was younger. I frowned at that. He seemed young to me already. Barely older than 2.5 decades. How much younger would he have had to have been? How old is he? I found my lips asking before the thought had even fully formed in my head. Terif's eyes snapped to mine, and his whole body seemed to tense in uncertainty before he glanced away. Old Chapter 12. The closer we got to the mountain, the more distant Terif became. His silent, brooding stares at nothing in particular grew twice as long. His strong shoulders never seemed to ease out of the stiffness that had fallen over them, and he barely said a word, not that that was anything new. His strong features never seemed to drop that emotional's mask, but every once in a while it would slip and I could see the anxiousness he tried to hide. He was worried about something, incredibly so, and it was really starting to freak me out. I had never seen him act so uncertain before. What's wrong? I asked softly as we stood side by side at the railing of the small merchant ship, the air cold as ice as we watched the frozen water give way under the heavy weight of the boat. He drummed his strong fingers against the wooden rail. There is nothing wrong. I am just ready to get off this ship. His gruff voice growled as his bright golden eyes scanned through the thick, icy fog surrounding us. I knew his wolf gaze could see through the white mist clearly, as if it were never there to begin with. Sadly, I could not. Is spending time with me that bad? I asked with a soft laugh, just to ease the tension strumming through the large wolf born, but he only grunted in response. Oh, maybe spending time with me was that bad. I do not like spending much time away from the mountain. I was surprised at the rather soft voice that passed his hard lips, but I didn't question him as I stared down at the icy water. I am just anxious to be home. I bit my bottom lip and nodded beside him. Yes, I knew what he meant. I knew what that was like. I was beyond excited to be back in the north, but I wasn't sure if that was because of nostalgia, or the king waiting for our arrival. Besides, I was extremely ready for a warm bath, besides some lukewarm water in a bucket. I hadn't been able to properly wash myself since the lower kingdom. Land ho! The voice shouted from high up the ship's tall mast, and I barely had time to register the fact that the vessel's speed was shorter if had turned and took off for our luggage. All right then. The snow will be falling harder the higher up the mountain we travel. His dark voice growled as he slung his bag over his shoulder and reached down to grab a hold of mine. I wrapped the thick cloak tighter around me with a frown. Was he really going to carry both of those the entire time? And the temperature will continue to drop. Is it very cold in your kingdom? My voice was soft as it passed my lips, my breath leaving my body as warm steam in the freezing air. That was more or less a rather ridiculous question. This was the north. It was going to be cold regardless of where we went, but I never spent a true winter on the mountain before. I had no idea how freezing the snow could truly be. His bright golden eyes slanted over to mine. On the outskirts, yes. But the king has a central heating system underground that pumps warm air throughout the lower village. Besides, he growled as he stood near the ramp of the boat and waited for the ship to dock. "We are wolves. We were born to withstand the winter." I let out a small sigh and rolled my eyes. And there was that superiority complex I was so starting to miss. I honestly envied how proud he was of his kind, of their woven nature. It made me yearn for that kind of loyalty and pride in something. It wasn't long before ship pulled into the almost deserted sea-side town, and my eyes widened when the white fog almost instantly cleared. How odd. Besides a thick floor of snow and ice, the streets were completely deserted. No sign of life or warmth in the entire town. I frowned as the ramp of the ship descended. Was everyone hiding in the safety and warmth of their homes? Terif gave a few goodbyes and thank yous to some of the crew members before disembarking with both of our bags clutched tightly in his grasp. I sighed and shook my head before falling slowly after him. For someone who seemed so worried to be returning, he sure was in a hurry. "Watch your step, my lady." His voice was still that dark grumble of a growl as he dropped his bag just in time to reach out and stop me from slipping on a thin patch of ice that had accumulated at the base of the ramp. I gave him a grateful smile as his large hand practically picked me up and helped me over the short ledge. He let out an irritated sigh when he let go of my arm and reached down for his bag once again. "Try to step where I step. Otherwise, you will be falling on your ass the whole way up the mountain." I frowned at the brisk tone in his voice, but didn't bother replying as I followed his large figure away from the white fog rolling off the freezing ocean. Something was obviously bothering him, something more than just homesickness. He was concerned about something, and I had an inkling feeling that it involved the king. I hoped I didn't actually get him in trouble. It was long before we were traveling away from the little sea-side village and up the snow-trotted path of the mountain. Not even animal in sight. I breathed in the fresh, freezing air and let out a content sigh. I was happy to be back on the mountain, back in the snow, happy to go see the king if that nervous excitement brewing in my chest was anything to go by. Just as Terif had said, the snow and sleet seemed to fall harder from the sky with each forward step we took, and I had to stop on more than a few occasions to catch my breath and blow warm air into my freezing hands. Terif didn't bother hiding how much my little stops aggravated him. "We will have to stop here for the night." He growled on an irritated sigh when we reached a little clearing not even half way up the mountain. The snow was started to fall too heavily for me to see through, and the damp cold had started to creep into my cloak. I shivered and sucked in deep, freezing breaths as I sat slowly down on my trunk. "Oh, really? We're not even half way up the mountain yet." It's not that I was thankful for the long-awaited break. I just figured he would have wanted to go non-stop until we reached his home, no matter how disastrously freezing it became. He snarled and flashed those golden eyes at me before dropping his bag to the ground. "No, and we won't ever be if we keep going at your ridiculous pace," he snapped before turning around and heading for the thick patch of trees surrounding us. "I'm going to find wood for a fire." His voice was a hard snarl as he snapped over his shoulder before disappearing into the snow and ice-covered trees without so much as a glance back. I frowned and huddled further into my cloak in a desperate search for warmth. And here I was thinking we were actually being friendly to one another now. I let out a sigh and pressed my face into the warm fabric surrounding me. I just had to remind myself that he was nervous about something, anxious about something. Hopefully he would relax whenever we reached the kingdom. I jumped as the loud sound of crashing wood reached my ears, and I lifted my head from the warm cloak to see the general crouching down low across from me. To fire, stones clutched tightly in his hands. "I thought you didn't need the warmth. Being a wolf born and all," I murmured sardonically, if only to get a different reaction out of him. I was starting to miss his taunting, sarcastic amusement. His golden eyes flickered up to me and narrowed before dropping back down to the two sparking stones he hit together. "I don't. This is for you." His voice had softened somewhat, but it only caused my mouth to pull into a frown. I definitely did not miss how bipolar he usually was. The fire started quickly, despite the dampness of the wood, and he took a seat on the cold, snowy ground across from me. I curled my knees to my chest and rested my heavy head against them. Night had not fallen yet, but the sky was still dark from the blizzard billowing down the mountain, and my body was cold and drained. I was growing ridiculously tired. "I am sorry for snapping at you." Terif's deep voice came out as a soft grumble over the crackling fire. I raised my head and blinked over at him, but his golden gaze stayed locked on the flickering flames. "It's okay," I mumbled softly as I pulled the hood of the cloak over my head and curled my knees tighter to my chest. The heat from the fire slowly melted the snow surrounding us, but did little to stop the large flakes falling from the side. He was quiet again as I leaned against the cold log behind me and felt my heavy eyes begin to close. "Get some rest. Lady Emrie, I will not allow you to stop as much as you have been tomorrow." I let out a distressed sigh before rolling my eyes behind closed lids. Oh joy and I had woken up covered in a thin layer of snow and ice. The fire had long since died, and I was positive the only reason I had not frozen to death during the brutally freezing night was the large wolf that had curled up at my side. Terif's dark fur had tickled my nose, but I didn't care as I pressed myself into the warmth of his back. I wasn't sure how long I had been sleeping, but all I could remember was shivering and groaning at the impossible cold until his large animal body curled up at my side. I had latched onto him like a newborn cub. The wolf clutched under my fingers' tips was still besides the steady rise and fall of his chest, and I pressed my chilly face into his soft fur as he let out a loud snort, his breath turning to steam in the freezing air. I pulled away and let out a tired yawn. He snarled, "Good morning." I mumbled with a sigh as I pulled slowly away from the warm body and rubbed the sleep from my face. The wolf rolled to his front and shook the snow from his thick brown fur with a low growl before standing tall on all fours. I blinked up at him with wide eyes. No matter how many wolf-borns I have, or will ever see, I will never get over how large his kind were. His wolf seemed to grunt in greeting before he turned and disappeared between the thick trees. My gaze followed after him. Was I supposed to follow him? The large human form of the general that I was actually used to walked back out of the trees a moment later, his hand tying his large cloak back around his shoulders. I gave him a sheepish smile. "Thank you, don't mention it," he growled as he bent down and lifted his bag from the ground. I frowned before standing slowly to my feet, but still am serious. "My lady, don't." I frowned at the hard gruff in his tone, but snapped my mouth shut as he reached down and grabbed my bag off the floor. "Let's go. I would much rather sleep in my own bed tonight." He snarled before turning his back towards me and started up the path once again. I wrapped the cloak tighter around my chilly body before trying to hurry after him. Why cowldn't he ever just accept sex but thank you? I sighed and pulled the hood farther over my head. The long, warm material worked wonders against the freezing cold. We hiked up the large, snow-encrusted mountain in silence. The general seemed even more anxious than he had the day before, and his shoulders only seemed to tense with each passing hour. I had to bite my lip constantly to keep from asking what was wrong. He would only refuse to tell me anyway. We crossed his territory just before sunset, and I couldn't help but notice the small smile that pulled on his hard lips. He truly was happy to be back, although the tension in his shoulders did not ease. I wanted to stop and stare up at him in wonder. Seeing a genuine smile on the wolf-born's face was such an oddity that I wanted to store it in my memory forever. But he was hurrying further up the mountain before I could. I was freezing anyway. The snow was falling as heavily as rain, and the cold had seeped past the cloak nearly an hour ago. I was more than ready for a nice, warm fire. I doubt the king will want us walking right through the village and into his castle. Terif finally spoke once the sharp peaks and terraces of 𝐊𝐢𝐧𝐚 came into view. My heart skipped in my chest. We were close, and getting closer with each passing step. I would see him tonight. I would see the king before the day was over, and my chest was suffocating my heart at the thought. I let out a shaky breath. I'm sure my absence was noted, and I doubt walking through the town with a strange underling will go unnoticed. We will have to enter through the tunnels beneath the castle. I wanted to frown at his words, but I found myself nodding anyway. No one knew about me, or that I even existed. The king wanted it that way. Besides, Just being there was enough of a thrill for me. Unlike the last time I had traveled into 𝐿𝐸𝐵's territory, there were guards patrolling a good mile away from the gates, but one nod from Terif had them scurrying on their way. They were bigger than any shifter I had ever seen, but the general and the king still towered over them. It was interesting. I followed the large wolf, borne further into the dense trees of the snow-blanketed forest, and continued trudging through the thick cold until he pulled us to a stop at the base of a large rock formation. "I have informed the king of our arrival," Terif announced as we walked slowly up to the two soldiers standing guard over a large metal door. I frowned and blinked up at him in confusion. I had been with him since we left the ship, and I hadn't seen him use that black little stone that seemed to show the king since we were at sea. But how his golden eyes flashed and the look on his face was his usual "don't bother asking because I won't answer" mask. I sighed and shook my head. Why did I even bother? "Delta General." The soldiers said in unison and bowed to the large wolf, born standing a few steps ahead of me before they turned in motion for the large door to open. I tried to hide my gasp as I gazed up in shock as the giant hunk of metal seemed to move on its own. A dark tunnel appeared before us, one lit by large torches held high along its ceiling. I blinked up at the dim light. Who would have ever that something like this rested inside the mountain? Terif nodded his head at the guards before stepping into the large tunnel and gesturing me to follow. I did, slowly, and beamed up at the large rocks overhead as I stepped past the guards. Their curious gazes followed us into the underground cavern, but they made no move to speak as we walked further away from them. I jumped and let out a small squeak when that large metal door closed loudly behind us. Terif chuckled. "That was funny." I snapped and huddled further into my cloak as I glared at his large back. The snow could not reach us here, and despite the surprising warm air that wafted over us, I still felt a chill roll down my spine. "I find all your little surprise noises amusing." I could feel the familiar heat of embarrassment crawl up my neck and I huffed before Grumpy L while keeping my mouth shut. I did not make surprised little noises. "Do the guards know about me?" I asked softly a few silent minutes later as we began to walk up a rather steep rise in the tunnel. Terif grunted. "No, only I and the other generals know about you. But the guards are smart enough to not question any of us, or our motives. They will not speak of seeing underling to others." We were quiet again as we walked the rest of the lengthy tunnels to wherever part of the castle he was taking me. I tried to pay attention to the many twists and turns of the dark corridors, but I ended up only confusing myself and giving up. These caverns were a labyrinth. I was just about to announce that I needed a break, my breathing hard in my chest and my legs screaming at me to stop, when Terif suddenly veered into a small side tunnel that was almost too narrow for his large body. My brows furrowed together, but I followed closely behind him. The small hallway led to an even smaller door, one he paused outside of before looking back at me. "You have a passion for talking and asking questions," the general spoke softly, his gold eyes flashing in the dim light as they gazed over at me. His jaw clenched. "Don't. Not unless the king says you can." I frowned at that, at the way his voice hardened as that 𝐸motional's mask he loved so much fell back into place. I could only nod. His hard eyes stayed locked on my gaze a moment more before he pushed the small door open and eased out onto a red-carpeted hallway with bright lights hanging high above the ceiling. My breath caught in my throat as I followed slowly after him, my eyes wide in awe. The hallway was magnificent, and 10 times taller than any building I had ever been in. Stone and marble statues lined either side, their hard, dark scowls like proud armor as they gazed soullessly at one another. I tried not to flinch and hide behind Terif as the one beside me suddenly slid along the floor and hid the door we had just came from. "Wow," I murmured into the large, deserted hall as the general began walking along the thick red carpet. I hurried to catch up to him. "Yes, it is very beautiful." He spoke lowly, his deep voice resonating around the marble statues and stone pillars surrounding us. I could only nod in agreement. "Where is everyone?" I asked a moment later as he turned a corner and led me down a smaller, not as extravagant hall. "In their houses, or chambers. It is getting late." and the king does not like people wandering around at night during the heavy snow. I was too busy staring out the snow, encrusted windows lining the hall, that I nearly bumped right into his large back when he suddenly stopped outside a large, dark, wooden door and dropped our bags to the floor. Loud, male, a well witch, male, voices sounded through the heavy wood, but were too muffled to make out clearly. My heart thumped heavily in my chest. The king was on the other side of that door. I could practically feel it. I stared up at Terif as he gazed down at the silver handle, his shoulders stiff, his jaw clenched. The nervous anxiousness from before was back in full force, and resting heavily on his wide shoulders. It tugged at my heart. Terif, I started softly, my hand reaching out to rest reassuringly on his arm, but he was opening the door and stepping inside before I could. My hand fell heavily to my side. He just refused to let anyone help him in any way. It was aggravating. The room was rather big, with a large, stone fireplace lit at one end, and a grand, rectangular table station right in the center. Tall windows lined the far wall, and it was easy to stare through them and out into the beautiful sight of the kingdom below. My eyes hadn't taken enough of the gorgeous sight. 6 pairs of eyes turned to us from the table, and silence instantly fell over the room. My heart nearly stopped beating in the confines of my chest. My lord, Terif bowed deeply in front of me, his large form bending at the waist as he spoke directly to the king, as if the other 5 were never there. The king of the north, who was staring over at me with eyes so lightning blue they make gruesome strides to my flesh. My breath caught in my throat. This was so completely different than watching him as that blue apparition from the ship, or longing for him in my dreams. He was real now. We both were. Our eyes locked in that unwavering gaze we always seemed to share whenever we first saw one another, and all I could do was stand just inside of the room like a wide-eyed buffoon. Terif stayed bowed in front of me. "You are all dismissed." That voice that I had wished to hear for weeks spoke strongly through the large room, and sent an oddly pleasant shiver straight down my spine. His gaze still did not leave mine. The 5 very large, very quiet men sitting at the table with the king immediately stood and bowed their heads towards Eric before heading for the door, all their gazes locked on mine and Terif's. "So this is the famous Emrie." I jumped in surprise as my name passed from one of their lips, and my gaze finally tore from the king so I could stare wide, eye up at the light-haired man beaming down at me as he walked by, his dark green eyes glowing in amusement. A dark growl reverberated around the room, and sent another shiver down my spine when I realized it had come from the king. "Shut the fuck up. 𝐿𝐷𝐸." Another man with dark hair and equally dark eyes growled before shoving the one who spoke out the door. The first man, 𝐿𝐷𝐸, chuckled as I tried not to make it obvious that I cowered closer to Terif in slight fear. One general or the king I could handle, but having 5 and 5 insanely large, growling men surrounding me was going to making my head spin. I wouldn't have been surprised if I actually fainted. It wasn't until all 5 of the large wolf-borns had left and closed the door behind them that I looked back up at the king. He was standing beside the table now, his blue eyes dark for once as his strong jaw clenched. "You may rise, General." Terif rose slowly from that uncomfortable-looking bow, but remained passively quiet as I stood awkwardly to the side. The king's gaze was no longer locked on mine, and his attention seemed focused solely on Terif. I had no idea what to do. There was silence between the 3 of us, a painfully tense, hard silence until Terif began to walk forward. I stayed by the closed door silently, my eyes wide as I watched the 2 wolves. Whatever was happening, whatever was about to happen, felt like a private matter. I felt like I was intruding on something that I was supposed to witness, and I was more or less right. I couldn't help the gasp that passed my lips when Terif stopped barely a meter away from the king, and fell hard on his knees. "Forgive me, my king. I have failed you." The deep sorrow that filled the general's voice tore at my chest as he hung his head low and looked down at the hard ground below him, his whole demeanor completely miserable. My heart broke at the sight, but the king didn't seem to care. He stood motionless across from Terif, the hard expression on his face and wavering as he stared down at his general. His thick arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his large body leaning casually against the edge of the table as sparked dangerously. I felt my lips pull into a frown. What was going on? I will graciously accept any punishment you deem fit, what? No. I heard my voice suddenly stammer as I took a small, hurried step forward, my hesitation over the awkwardness quickly fading. Terif's shoulder stiffened, and the small growl that escaped his lips let me know how unwanted I was at that moment, but I didn't care. The king's blue eyes snapped to mine, and my heart fluttered at the dark look shining back at me. He didn't do anything wrong, he allowed you to be hurt. I was ready to hear that dark, beautiful voice directed at me, and despite the fact that there was no anger in it, my breath caught in my throat. The tension in Terif's shoulders disappeared before they sagged even more than before. This is what he had been beating himself up over, worrying about what the king would do to him because I had been hurt. No, that was right. He didn't do anything wrong. No, he didn't. He saved me and my friend. I was lucky to escape with just a bump on my head, my lady. Terif suddenly snapped, his head raising just enough to shoot that hard, golden gaze at me in clear warning. Shut up. Or at least, that's what I thought he was trying to tell me. I bit down hard on my bottom lip as the king's lightning eyes flared dangerously. Maybe I shouldn't have said anything. Just a bump on the head. I didn't know how to feel when he suddenly leaned off the table and walked around the large throne like chair, those words heavy as he rolled them around his tongue. But I knew that hollow, sinking feeling in my chest when he wouldn't look at me again was good. My lord, Terif started again, but could barely finish speaking before the king cut him off. The West Wing is hers, General. Take her there. My chest closed painfully around my heart. That was it. That was all I would get to say to him. Get to spend time with him. Had my words really angered him that much? I tried to swallow the painful knot that suddenly rose in my throat, and focus my gaze on the surprised Terif as he rose slowly back to his feet. But north now. My breath caught in my throat when Terif gave him a small bow before turning towards me, his golden eyes practically murderous. I gulped and took a step back as he stalked towards. The king stood silently by the table the entire time, his blue eyes locked on something outside the window as he faced away from us. My heart ached at the sight. I don't know why I expected anything different. He made it quite obvious before that he didn't know what to do with me, and now that I'd practically talked back to him, he was probably regretting ever telling the general to bring me here. I chewed hard on my bottom lip to get my mind off the painful grip tightening around my chest. After you, Terif growled as he held the door open for me, and didn't bother adding the my lady part. He was really mad. I cast one more sad, pathetic glance back at the stoic king before walking back into the hall. The large wolf-born followed after me, and slammed the door. I flinched. General eyed to start as he bent down and picked my bag off the floor, but he was already stalking down the hall and away from me before I could speak. I frowned and hurried after him. You can't really be angry at me. I spoke against the tense silence surrounding us as he led me up a step of marble steps and down another looking extravagant hall. He didn't answer. He didn't even growl or snarl. You were practically begging him to punish you over something you couldn't control. I finally shouted at his ridiculously large back in aggravation as he continued to stalk angrily down the hall. I hit my head. So what? People hit their heads all the time. It's nothing to feel responsible over. You don't fucking get it. Terif suddenly snapped and turned on me with such a furious anger in his gold eyes that it actually made me take a step back in fear. My heart skipped a beat as my eyes widened at anger in his. But his gaze did not soften, if anything. He only grew angrier. You didn't just hit your head. The back of your skull was cracked open and broken. You were bleeding out onto the street, and I couldn't stop it. You were literally dying. And I had to. He cowled and finished speaking. His eyes were turning an odd black and his whole body began to tremble in that way it did before he shifted. My mouth fell open in horror, and I could only stare up at him in shock as his large body shook. My skull had been broken. He saved me from dying. Why hadn't he told me that? He let out a shuddering breath and closed his dark eyes before leaning a heavy hand against the wall at his side. You had almost died. Emre. And that is my fault. I will undertake whatever punishment North deems suitable. Terif. No, these are your chambers. This gruff growl interrupted me and leaned off the wall to nod to a decent-sized door across from us. I must return back to the king. I'm sure he would want you to make yourself at home. He dropped my bag in front of the door and pushed past me before walking back down the hall without another word or glance back. I could only stare after him, my own body shaking slightly. I had almost died, and I never knew. My soul had been cracked, broken. How in the hell did he save me?